All right, for those of you who have just logged on, good evening. Thank you so much for joining us for tonight's webinar. I welcome you to introduce yourself in the chat if you haven't done so already, so you could share your name, where you're watching from, and what you hope to gain from tonight's program. And just in case you missed the notification, this session is being recorded, so it will be available later, and we will be sending it out via email as well. So wanted to make you all aware of that. And while we're doing introductions, I will introduce myself as well. So hello, my name is Jordan Hayden. I use she, her pronouns, and I am VPIRG's Keep Vermont Cool campaign manager. It is a privilege to be here with you all this evening. And I think a few folks will probably continue to trickle in, but we will get started just for the sake of time. And before we go any further, I would like to start us off with a very important land acknowledgement. So as you'll see on your screen, I'd like to take a moment to recognize the Indigenous peoples of Vermont, particularly the Abenaki Nation, whose traditional territory many of us are calling from today. We acknowledge them as the past, present, and future caretakers of this land, which includes the lakes, the rivers, forests, and so much more. So I do encourage you all to seek additional resources and get involved by visiting the Vermont Indigenous Heritage Center and the Abenaki Arts and Education Center. So with that, I will now walk us through tonight's agenda. Okay, so first I'll spend just a few minutes telling you all about our Keep Vermont Cool climate action campaign, mainly why we do it and what we're up to right now. Then I'll pass it over to our friends at Rebuild by Design so they can talk through the new Vermont chapter of the Atlas of Disaster. And then we'll take some time immediately following for some Q&A. So have your questions ready or feel free to type them in the Q&A box below as we go. And then we'll conclude with an action item. It's pretty simple but important, and you can all take it as we're on this call together. Okay, so moving right along, I'd like to share a brief update and overview of our climate action campaign, Keep Vermont Cool. So the mission of this campaign is really to change the narrative on climate here in the state of Vermont. And to do that means mobilizing Vermonters to take action on climate and encouraging elected leaders to prioritize important climate issues. And we launched this campaign a little over a year ago, and since then, we've hosted over 100 virtual and in-person events, which include stop on our voter registration series, climate action and advocacy tour, and Green Jobs Summer Showcase, as well as one-off tabling events like concerts, rallies, soccer games, farmers markets, things of that nature. So it's been a whole lot of fun. And we've also knocked on over 65,000 doors last year through VPIRG's Summer Canvas initiative, where folks got to learn more about the campaign and were encouraged to vote with climate in mind. And of course, last but not least, we mobilized over 17,000 Vermonters into taking meaningful forms of climate action, like signing petitions, writing to elected leaders, showing up to events, or sharing a personal climate story. And because we've been exploring new territory and starting climate conversations in places really all over the state, over 10,000 of those Vermonters are completely new to the climate movement, which is something that we're really proud of. So if this all sounds brand new to you and you're wondering how to get involved with the campaign, I have this slide just for you. So first, you can learn more and sign the petition to Keep Vermont Cool at keepvermontcool.org. You can also follow us on all major social media platforms at Keep Vermont Cool. We post all of the latest events and opportunities there. And if you're interested in merchandise that is locally sourced, sustainable, and made from organic cotton, you can check out our shop at keepvermontcool.org/shop. And if you'd like to tell us your experience with climate change, we would love to hear it. So you can share your personal story at keepvermontcool.org/climate-stories. You can read other Vermonter stories there as well. So you have just heard a lot from me, so I think I'd better turn it over now to our incredible friends at Rebuild by Design. But if you haven't heard of this organization before, I will give you a quick introduction. So through regional competitions, local engagements, research, and policy, Rebuild by Design is reimagining the way communities find solutions for today's large-scale complex problems by creating collaborations across communities and governments. Rebuild convenes global expertise with regional leadership and community stakeholders to gain a better understanding of how overlapping environmental and human-made vulnerabilities leave communities at risk. Rebuild's core belief is that through collaboration, our communities can grow stronger and better prepared to stand up to whatever challenges tomorrow brings. So with that, I'd like to tell you a bit about the folks joining us today, starting with Managing Director Amy Chester. Amy Chester has spent more than 25 years in municipal policy, community engagement, real estate development, and communications advocating for the built environment. As the Managing Director of Rebuild by Design, Chester's first task was to lead an international design-driven competition that utilized a truly inclusive and collaborative process to create implementable large-scale infrastructure projects to address the physical and social vulnerabilities exposed by Hurricane Sandy in the Northeast United States. Under her leadership, Rebuild by Design transformed the competition's collaborative approach into an organization that helps governments and communities replicate its success for a variety of scales and locations around the world to address challenges such as climate change, transportation, housing, community collaboration, and equity. Previously, Chester worked for NYC Mayor Michael Bloomberg as Chief of Staff to the Deputy Mayor for Legislative Affairs and as a Senior Policy Advisor. Chester's other experiences in New York City government have included positions at the New York City Council and at the New York City Housing Authority. Outside of government, Chester's accomplishments include overseeing the development of a medical home for the Freelancers Union, crafting a democratic process which brought together 5,000 New Yorkers, launching the Metropolitan Waterfront Alliance through MNR Strategic Services, and working on numerous electoral campaigns, including Hillary Clinton's winning New York State Senate and Barack Obama's presidential campaigns. So I'd also like to tell you about Johanna Lawton, Rebuild by Design's project manager. So Johanna Lawton is a project manager at Rebuild by Design, supporting resilient infrastructure initiatives at local, state, and national levels, as well as collaborative stakeholder engagements. Through research and design, she has contributed to various publications to advance the use of multi-benefit infrastructure. Previously, Lawton worked for the Institute of International Humanitarian Affairs as the managing editor of the Refuge Press, where she worked at the intersection of human rights, social justice, global development, and literature. Lawton, along with Chester, is also a founding member of Resilience PAC, a member-driven political action committee dedicated to ensuring New York City adapts to climate change equitably by helping climate-forward candidates get elected to local offices, and serves as a public member of Manhattan's Community Board too. So Amy and Johanna, thank you both so much for being here. I will let you take it away. And you are muted, Amy.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Jordan. And thank everybody for being here, especially on this super hot day. So I hope that you're inside and keeping cool because it's a scorcher out there. So Rebuild by Design is an organization. We're located in New York City, and we're essentially a process that brings together strong stakeholder support with governments to uncover and create solutions to climate change, usually in the adaptation space. And we got our start during Hurricane Sandy, and I thought it was pretty important to tell you about our start because we started in the wake of a very bad storm, which is very similar to what you're going through right now. And we'll tell you a little bit about what we did afterwards, and hopefully we can work together. So this is Hurricane Sandy hitting the Northeast United States 11 years ago this October. And this is how it left our region. This is New York, New Jersey, and Connecticut were the most hit by this, you probably remember. 650,000 homes damaged or destroyed, 8 million people without power. And what it showed us is that we need to come together and do other solutions. So sorry that this slide, I think, is actually out of order, but I'll just tell you that the 3 ways that we work together are through large-scale regional design competitions, which is what I'm going to talk to you about first, innovative processes to address the city's challenges, and research and policy, which is what my colleague Johanna is going to be talking about. So what Hurricane Sandy showed us, and probably what the recent flood showed you, is the interconnection between social resilience and physical resilience. And we realized that you cannot solve one without the other. The idea of social resilience begun as Eric Kleinenberg's work. He's a sociologist. He actually runs the institute that we are part of at New York University. And he looked at the 1995 Chicago heat wave that killed 700 people. However, it didn't kill the city kind of equally. There was some major differences. And what he found is that communities that looked the same, that acted the same, that maybe they were low income, maybe they were African American, they were maybe side by side, they actually fared very different. And the difference was how close they lived to each other and how well they knew their communities. And for the neighborhoods that knew their community better, can check on their neighbors, would know if somebody was missing, they had 100 less deaths than in other places. And he started this idea of social resilience. It's been kind of transformed into social infrastructure. And if you haven't read Palaces for the People, which came out about 2 years ago, you should, because it's very interesting. And what we realized after the storm, and you may feel the same way, is that a typical design process doesn't work, because a design process means that you know what you want to build and you back into it. So if you know what policy you want to create, if you know what you want to build, let's say you want to build a hospital or a school, you know what your footprint is, you know what your budget is, and you back your way into it. But what we're learning about climate events is that we need to do another process to actually get us to the right answers, because we are working in a time where it's never been replicated before. So we launched the Hurricane Sandy Design Competition about 6 months after the Hurricane Sandy hit the Northeast. And it was launched inside of HUD. So this was a federal government sponsored program where they set aside $1 billion of the disaster recovery funds to do an international call out for teams to work with communities on the ground and local governments to come up with large scale solutions to address climate change. It was focused on the Northeast United States. Over 140 teams applied and 10 were chosen. And this was very innovative at the time, because it was the first time that post-disaster dollars were able to be spent in a way that doesn't just put back exactly what was there before. And this was very innovative. It was done under the America Competes Act under President Obama, and has now since been replicated in many different ways. And essentially what it is 2 stages. One is collaborative research, and the second is collaborative design. And what we mean by collaborative research is getting everyone together and having those conversations and really learning from each other, like what happened during a storm, but what were all the vulnerabilities that existed there before. So in this case, we brought all the 10 teams, about 200 people, some of which were local and many of which were not, to the Sandy affected region, and really had them walking the streets with community members, going on site visits, creating panel discussions and neighborhood leader meetings so they could understand all the different typologies in the region and how each of them were dealing with the post-disaster problems. And then we moved to a collaborative design stage, and like the research stage, we were out in communities trying to understand who are all the stakeholders, going to government agency meetings and really designing side by side with the permitting agencies and with the community members that are most affected by the storms to come up with solutions that help both. And what we mean by stakeholders is very broad. And I think this is really important because everyone is a stakeholder. It's all the government agencies that have permitting power. It's all the different community organizations, but it's also industry. It's also the people who own the property or have a say in what is going on. It's incredibly important that everybody comes at the table together and hears each other and can learn from each other as you're creating these solutions. We also added some really fun and interesting events to get folks out that maybe wouldn't come to a normal design charrette. Here are 3 different flyers. One is from a small business event that we did in Rockaway, which is a peninsula in Queens in New York City. Another is what is called a slam bake. It was essentially a food making process, or a recipe making process, where it was held in the area that has storage for all the region's food. It's called Hunts Point, and it's in the South Bronx. And then lastly is a flyer from an event that we did with teenagers, biking up and down the Pequannock River, which is a river that's been filled in over time. That is a source of a lot of flooding issues. And we started out with 5 philanthropic funders and 4 partner NGOs. But in the end, in just 9 months, we worked with over 140 neighborhoods, almost 20 universities, over 500 community organizations, and over 180 government agencies. And this is an enormous amount of outreach and process. Though if you divide any of these by 10, you can kind of get the feeling of what each design team did in their locations. And why do we do this and why is it so important? It's because these processes and these projects will take generations. As communities adapt to climate change, we're not going to do it overnight. It's going to take a very long time. And budget cycles end, and elections go and come. And it's really important that the folks on the ground who will stay can advocate for their own visions over time. So in the end, we had 10 very large comprehensive projects, and the government awarded $930 million to 7 of those projects. Those projects all began to be implemented right after. Around 2016, we begun, and about half of them have broken ground already, and they now have $4.3 billion of investment. And that means that we went from 930 million in 2015 to $4.3 billion. And I think that's really important to show is that if you have big ideas and you have support from stakeholders, it will attract money and investment. So don't shy away from those big ideas. We then took this process around the world and we did it on many different scales, on many different issues, including in the Bay Area, where we ran a similar process of the same size and scale with all 9 counties in the Bay. And that was for climate resilience planning, not in response to a storm. And out of that process, we started realizing that other governments are doing some really cool things, especially California, but many governments have done very great things. And we wanted to turn around and look at our home state and figure out what was happening there. So we did a little bit of research to understand what was happening in New York State. And these are images that we found. Coming from New York City, we had a good understanding of the coastal issues, but we did not understand that it was also affecting the Great Lakes communities, riverine communities, through rain and through storm surge. So we took that information and we made a very simple map. And this is kind of the beginning of the Atlas of Disaster. We took this map, and what we were able to show very simply is that every single county in New York State had disaster declarations. In this case, we were looking at 2011 to 2019, and we were looking at both federal and state disasters. And we found that every county had a disaster declaration, and many of them had at least 2, and that 60% of them had more than 5. And what you're able to see very easily is that it's not a New York City issue. It's not a coastal issue. It's upstate and downstate. It's Democrat and Republican. And I have a background in political organizing. And what I realized pretty much immediately is that we can create a coalition of people across the state that can actually do something about it. So taking that map and about a year's worth of work, we convinced Governor Cuomo through a lot of outreach to people just like you to introduce an environmental bond act, which means it's a voter-initiated ballot question, which you could do in New York State. I know you can't do it in Vermont, to essentially ask the voters if we should spend extra dollars to a specific purpose. And he introduced it as a $3 billion environmental bond act. It was then raised by our new governor, Kathy Hochul, to $4.2 billion, which was approved by voters in 2022. We then looked for some partners to expand this work, and I'm going to turn this over to Johanna Lawton. But with partnership from iParametrics and Optum Engineering, and with support from Siegel Family Endowment, the Rockefeller Brothers Fund, Tiger Global, and Rockefeller Family Fund, we were able to turn that one state into an entire report for the United States.
Thanks so much, Amy, and good evening, everybody. So just as Amy said, we were then, with our partnerships, able to expand our scope to the entire nation to create a report that captured disaster impacts on a county level, using data for every county in the US, which resulted in over 300 maps. It's a beast of a report, but we're going to give you a little bit of a download of how to approach it and how you can understand the important information that's in it. This report also includes a discussion around our current disaster and adaptation policies in the US and what we believe needs to be changed, as well as a discussion of the cost of inaction and a guide for states to build a collaborative program with communities to design and plan for equitable climate infrastructure. The report also includes new finance tools, suggestions for cost-benefit reform, and recommendations for federal and state policy makers to ensure that we are planning ahead of the next disaster instead of planning or responding to a major shock. Next slide, please. And so just like we did with New York State, we were able to map out federal disaster declaration data for the entire country. And immediately when we saw this visual, we started seeing the same trends that we were noticing just within our own home state, that no matter how you slice and dice it, whether you are looking at coastal communities, riverine communities, the Great Lakes communities, mountain, desert, red states, blue states, urban, rural environments, everyone is being impacted by climate disasters. And what we found when we aggregated all this information, that in fact, 90% of counties in the US have had a federal disaster declaration due to extreme weather in recent history. And so immediately our mouths sort of hit the floor, though I'm sure some of you may be aware that, we've had an increasing number of events recently. We just didn't understand quite the extent of how far every community across the country was being impacted. So we also looked nationwide to understand the distribution of federal post-disaster assistance, again, seeing where communities were receiving a disproportionate number of federal post-disaster dollars after events. We also looked at energy reliability across the country to understand areas that had higher levels of energy unreliability that could be compounding the impacts of a major shock or stressor. And we made sure that this data, this information is available on our website. And specifically, if you don't want to tackle the full report, that you can look to specific states to understand the impacts in those states. So we encourage everyone to check out Rebuild by Design's website if you want to explore a certain state. But in particular, of course, the reason you're here today is because we want to talk to you about Vermont. And so with the data that we've had, we immediately turned our attention to doubling down on states where there is certainly a need to start thinking about planning for longer term climate adaptation solutions. And it just so happened that we were already actually working and researching on Vermont to expand on our data and our research when the flooding in July occurred. So we hustled to quickly release this information and to understand also the local context of what was happening and what were folks experiencing on the ground. And this report that is titled the Vermont Atlas of Disasters shows county level disaster declaration data, among other data sets that I'll cover in a moment, as well as we see this as a one-stop shop for climate-related statistics in Vermont that we hope you'll be able to pull from easily. It also gives suggestions for this guide for building a collaborative program in the state and some recommendations for financing these investments that are needed to adapt to climate change. So it has come to our attention quite recently that the tenor at the state leadership level may not be quite grasping the extent to which climate change has been impacting the state. We heard this recently that folks may think that climate impacts or an event like what happened in July is an anomaly. And in fact, what we found in our research is that Vermont has actually experienced 17 federally declared major disasters due to extreme weather just between 2011 to 2021. And 15 of those events were due to tropical storms and flooding. So that actually places Vermont 7th highest in the country for total number of federal disaster declarations, which ties it with Alabama, Texas, and West Virginia, and actually 5th for per capita post-disaster cost of federal assistance. We also found that every county has had 4 or more recent major disasters, and 6 counties have had at least 10 major recent disasters, with Washington County having had the highest. And I do just want to note, because we had bookended this data set in our analysis at 2021, we do know there were 2 more federal disaster declarations, of course, the most recent flooding that have occurred since we released this data, as well as USDA agriculture disaster declaration, I believe this past spring. So within our report, in this moment of recovery and rebuilding from the major flooding that occurred in July, we wanted to capture not just the statistics and the findings of our own analysis, but we have now included some new images and some research that we've been developing throughout the summer to better understand the climate impacts that have been occurring as well as are going to occur in Vermont. In our report, just like you saw on that nationwide scale and the statewide scale, we have laid out in red the disaster declaration map, which shows the number of occurrences of federal major disaster declarations between 2011 to 2021. And right next to that, we have the federal post-disaster assistance. So that is FEMA funding that has come from public assistance dollars and hazard mitigation dollars. And then we've also just included in that table the total HUD dollars that have been contributed or allocated to the state over that time. So you can see here, Vermont has received $370 million in post-disaster assistance from FEMA and HUD. And we do just, note that that's only a piece of the pie. Of course, this is just some of the federal disaster dollars that have gone to recovery from these events. We know there's also insurance payouts, private payouts, there's philanthropy. There are a number of other loan programs that come after a major disaster. So we do want you to get a sense of the magnitude, but also understand that this is a low estimation of the total cost of these events in the state. And so if you want to dig in deeper into the data behind these maps, you can look in our report. There is a full spreadsheet that shows the disaster declarations between the 2011 to 2021 for every county. So what you'll see is as you go across in this table, you'll find the names of counties, the number of climate disasters they have had in these years, the total FEMA obligations that county has received, and it goes across by year, by specific event. So you can look up a major disaster by its colloquial name or the actual declaration number and understand which counties it impacted and the total dollars that were allocated for that event. You will also find in our report a map of the social vulnerability index for Vermont, and that's placed right next to the energy reliability map. And we're really interested here in actually teasing out a bit more where there is really high social vulnerability and really low energy reliability, so we can start to better understand where that intersection exists. And then what we've actually developed in this new Vermont packet, which you won't find in our full Atlas of Disaster, is a map of the Vermont disaster declarations with an overlay of legislative districts. So here you can see disaster declarations in Vermont in the green map, and we have overlaid the Senate districts, and then on the right we have overlaid the General Assembly district. So if you are an advocate, you can use this as a tool to go to your representative and say, hey, we have had this many disasters in our district. What are you going to do about it? Equally, if you are a leader of a district, you can look to others and say, hey, our districts are really being impacted by these events. We need to work together to solve this challenge. And so quickly, I'll just run through. We've included throughout our report, which we hope you'll dive into and digest, some findings about the future impacts of projections for increasing precipitation and the costs of these events, the impact it will have on infrastructure, air temperature, the impact it will have on Vermont's agriculture industry, specifically the sugaring industry. We've also looked at the skiing industry. And then finally, we dug in a little bit to create this graphic to demonstrate that it's not just the immediate impacts of a disaster, it's also those cascading impacts that occur long after event. And we know that your communities are still recovering from the flooding in July, and these impacts can last or go on for months, years on end. And in particular, what we focus on in this graphic is the impacts to physical and mental health of people who have experienced a disaster. And then finally, in this report, if you want to also look at the If you want to see where Vermont stacks up again in comparison to other states, you can dig into this and understand, just as I mentioned at the start, Vermont has ranked 7th in total number of disaster declarations with 17 recent major disasters and 5th highest for per capita FEMA and HUD post-disaster assistance. And so we don't want you to just be thinking about these impacts as, this is what happened, what are we going to do about it? We actually do have some suggestions for moving ahead to ensure that we are planning in advance of the next major event instead of continuing this pattern of just responding to major disasters. We provide a program, an overview of a collaborative program where governments and municipalities can work with community members to plan and design resilient, climate smart, equitable infrastructure, how to judge those designs and ensure that they are meeting the needs of those most physically and socially vulnerable in the community. And then we also propose a couple different solutions for financing this challenge, because of course, these are going to be, there are going to be massive needs for resilient infrastructure. One such example is a surcharge on property and casualty insurance, which our analysis has found, our modeling has found that could raise $600 million for the state of Vermont, or a state-based climate super fund, which could raise potentially $2.5 billion in the state. And so what we want to see is that we start investing, start shifting the state's investments towards having a pool of funds we can draw on for communities to plan ahead instead of responding. And so we know there's a long road ahead for Vermonters. And as we ourselves are coming up, or actually just celebrating commemorating our 10-year anniversary since our origins, we also wanted to share what we've been learning since our recovery in New York first began. And I'll turn it back over to Amy to take that away.
Thank you, Joanna. So there's a number of things that we have learned. It's been quite the bumpy road building back from Hurricane Sandy. Of course, you've had events too. It's not your first time, but we wanted to take a moment to just maybe remind you of some of the things that I think are important looking forward. So the first one is that after a shock like an event, that people need a productive outlet for anger. Everyone is angry. People want their lives to go back to exactly how it was the day before the event. And we need to make sure that we take this moment and bring communities together and have the right conversations and take that anger and put it in a way that is really productive and will make sure that communities don't suffer in the future. That interdisciplinary groups create better outcomes. If you have a proposal just by the business community, just by the environmental community, just by schools, you're never going to get a proposal that is comprehensive and that is cost effective and is going to take care of what everybody needs. But if you bring people together that have different experiences, you will. The next is that procurement is hard. It takes a very long time to build these projects. So while there might be money that's coming into Vermont right now, it's going to not feel like there is a big change for quite a bit of time. The next is to think about these projects as regionally. So whether it's regionally across counties in Vermont or across states, you should be really taking a systems approach and thinking about waterways and different ways that our communities are brought together and divided, and think about approaching it that way. The next is to have faith in communities, because they know what happens and it always works out in the end. So I've been working for a long time in community organizing, and I will tell you that when you go into a community and you talk about climate events, they absolutely understand it, they're living it, and they can tell it to you better than other people can. They can show you where it flooded, they can show you how high it was, and they can show you that usually your maps are wrong, your flood maps. When we come together and we start thinking about the projects and programs, to make sure that they have a lot of benefits, that they're built in to address many, many problems at once. And that will essentially lower the costs and help you in that cost benefit analysis that is so important for federal dollars. And then lastly, that plans change. This is just a clip from October 2019, where after 4 years of having a very big comprehensive solution that came out of Rebuild by Design, the mayor of New York City decided overnight to change it. It set off a whole bunch of anger and confusion. And while a lot of people came together and supported the program, there are still people that didn't support that change. And that has been really hard. So we need to remember that plans change, and equally remember that if plans are going to change, we need to go back to those stakeholders and get their buy-in before plans change, or else we're going to end up with a divided community. So lastly, if you want to look at any of the projects that came out of the Rebuild by Design Hurricane Sandy competition, you can download our book on our website. We also have a second book for the work that we did in the Bay Area, and you can check out what came out of those projects. And then lastly, just a plug to work together. We're your neighbors. We're in New York. We're not that far away. And we are very interested in mobilizing investments into climate infrastructure. So we want to make sure that states are allocating dollars and that communities are at the table and shifting those investments to pre-disasters and planning together to come together and really vision what they want their community to be for the future. And we can also help on the data side, as we have these incredible partners and have access to some really great, interesting data. So thank you, Jordan and VPIRG, and we'd love to have a discussion.
Well, thank you so much for sharing, Amy and Johanna, and your entire team for developing such a critical resource for our state. I think there's a lot to unpack here, and I'm eager to share some questions from our audience. I know lots have already been coming in. We've been answering some already, but now is a great time to also add your question down in that Q&A box if you haven't done so already, and we will try to get through as many as we can. So let's get started. The first question I have for the both of you is, do you have any examples of states using your data to inform or take action successfully?
Well, I think New York is the best example, which we showed you before, because that we were able to do in a year. And a year is something that's very fast and it may not be able to do everywhere, but we were able to create that coalition using that data to create a $4 billion infrastructure fund. This data is pretty new, and we just put out the Vermont data maybe a month ago. So we hope that organizations will use it, and we'd love to talk to you about how you can use it.
Awesome. Thank you so much. All right. How long would it take to collect the $660 million from insurance and the $2.5 billion fund? Are these annual numbers or over some time frame?
I can answer the first one. It's the $660 million from insurance is a 2% surcharge on certain types of property and casualty insurance. So if you take the whole bucket of property and casualty and you back out medical malpractice and workers' comp because they don't have a connection policy-wise to flooding, you will get a number from there. And then if you bond it municipally, you will get $660 million in 10 years. Maybe somebody from VPIRG can, the $2 billion super funds. Jordan?
That might be a question that we follow up with folks on.
Okay.
But stay tuned for more on that. All right, so moving right along here, how does the influence of federal legislators have on getting money for each state, or is it more dependent on the state government's response and request for aid?
It's actually dependent on a lot of things because there's so many different pots of money that could be used for climate infrastructure. There's money that you'll get automatically because you're a federal disaster declaration, through FEMA. And then usually, but not always, and it can come in any period of time, is that states that have suffered disasters create coalitions with other states that have suffered disasters around the same time period, and their congressional representatives advocate for additional dollars. Those are usually community development block grant dollars. They're small business dollars or additional dollars that are completely voluntary. Congress doesn't have to allocate for it, doesn't have to allocate it after a disaster, but they do, but you never know how much you're going to get. So it is really important that you work with those congressional officials. But then also we have an enormous amount of money that's coming down from the federal infrastructure programs, transportation dollars, water dollars, all those have different time frames and different ways that you apply for them. Some of them nonprofit organizations and academia can have, some of them local governments can apply for, a lot of which you will need a local match. And that's why we think it's really important to create state level funding that could provide that local match, because towns and localities usually don't have extra money sitting around that they're able to use to draw down additional federal funds.
Great, thank you. And this just in, we did get a response as to the Vermont funding question, and that answer is $100 million a year for 25 years. So just wanted to follow up on that. So thank you so much. And now the next question, you might not have obviously a particular person in mind, but maybe a particular role of somebody who you might suggest for this. So who might best present to Middlebury Select Board the importance of climate change resilience planning?
I mean, I don't know who that's coming from, so I can see it's somebody named Judy Weiger-Crowe. So nice to meet you, Judy. It really depends on who is there. So it's always best to have it come from constituents. If the constituents understand it, maybe you're a constituent there. If it's not constituents, then local business organizations or environmental associations can present. And then lastly, statewide groups can present. So I'm sure VPIRG has lots of people who would love to have opportunities like that to go before government and share this information.
Thank you so much. And that somewhat ties into the question that we got here that says, how is Keep Vermont Cool connected to state legislators and the government's administration at the moment? And what is your plan to build on those ties? So the way that I would answer that question as someone who works on the campaign is that we don't really promote any particular policy or anything like that. Our goal is to really encourage our elected leaders to do more to act on climate. So that comes through with a variety of asks, whether it's writing to our elected leaders or showing up at the State House, having really strong conversations, inviting them to events, telling them everything that's happening here in the state of Vermont. And this is really great information that we can build into what we're sharing, whether it's at an event, whether it's sending an email, whether it's just showing up and having a conversation. So I think this is definitely something we can build into all of those materials. And like I said, it's not that we're pushing any particular political bill or anything of that nature, but just trying to have this holistic conversation about climate change, climate action. How can you sort of build that into the current work that you're doing at the State House? So that's how I would answer that question. All right, moving right along. I think we have time for a few more. How differentiated can the approach be taken by local communities, or is it more of a statewide approach?
I think it depends on the approach, really, because the answer is everyone. I mean, you need a statewide approach, you need a local approach, and you need them to be talking and working with each other. So local towns need to be on board and be asking for specific projects, but those projects need to have that stakeholder support locally. And then statewide, there needs to be a vision of how everything is going to fit together, especially when there's a system like a waterway or like a highway or a road that crosses many local boundaries, that you need to bring everyone together. And it's sometimes done really well on the state level. Sometimes elected officials can come together on their own. A couple of counties will come together and say, this is what we need. Usually post-disaster funding goes to the state and then trickles down to the localities. So the state has to be at the table in order for the localities to get their projects funded.
Gotcha, thank you. All right, is the surcharge on insurance paid by the insured or by the insurer?
It is paid by the insured, the policy holder. It can't be paid by the insurer, or if it was paid by the insurer, they probably would raise it for the same price. So in a state like New York, we have very high insurance, and we have a lot of insurance and a lot of different types of insurance, and it comes out to an average of $2 per month or $24 a year. And that's $24 a year. In New York State, we're able to take that money and it becomes $19 billion in 10 years. So it is, we haven't been able to figure it out for each state what that average would be for a cost, but knowing that Vermont is 600 million, according, versus New York's 19 billion, you can kind of get an understanding that it'll probably be less than $2 a month.
Great, thank you. All right, Vermont's disaster count is definitely a function of our landscape, mountain streams, and rivers. Most of our communities are built in floodplains. What other places around the world are dealing with this topography, and what are they doing? And perhaps even just from upstate New York, you might have some sense of how to answer that question.
Yeah, I mean, everyone is dealing with this. There are definitely communities like in Bangladesh that are on the front lines of climate and been dealing with this for way more severely than we have. But as you saw in the past couple of years, Hurricane Irma, Irene, Harvey, it went across the United States, and everyone is dealing with this in different ways. In some cases, people are choosing to move out of harm's way. So that's something that used to be called managed retreat. Now there's a lot of different names for it, but where communities are getting together and actually asking for their government to do a buyout so they move out of harm's way. In other places, they're fortifying the coastline. So for instance, one of our projects that is called the Big U, which is in Manhattan, is actually this like levee. A levee means like a raised surface around the lower Manhattan. So it's actually going to protect tens of thousands of people. And it's done in a way that it's social infrastructure. So for instance, one of it is done within a 57-acre park where that park is being raised 8 to 10 feet, which will stop the water from coming into the community and the public housing residents that live adjacent behind it. So there's lots of different approaches, and there's many ways that we think about it, but the most important thing is to be thinking about what is right for your community. So understanding all of your hazards, looking ahead of seeing how they will get worse. So as Vermont gets colder and warmer, as Vermont gets wetter and drier, what are all the ways that Vermont can be protected? And then coming up with those solutions that incorporate all of those vulnerabilities together.
I would also just add that I think Vermont's challenges with its landscape is also a potential solution, in that many communities around the country, around the world, are now looking more to nature to address these challenges, returning certain landscapes to their natural environment, or figuring out how nature can become one of our biggest assets in not just reducing our carbon emissions, but also actually, absorbing more water or slowing the flow of water before it gets to sewer infrastructure. So there are a lot of really innovative examples that Vermont can certainly look to. I also just want to mention, if you are interested in reading more about what other communities have been experiencing in a more personal narrative, there's a great book called The Great Displacement by Jake Biddle. It's a really interesting read where you can learn about what certain communities have experienced, and over a decade or more of either adaptation or maladaptation, what lessons have been learned from those.
Thank you. That is super helpful. All right, a few more, and then we'll wrap this up and move on to some closing remarks. But this question is new to the Rebuild by Design team and the efforts in Vermont, but what is happening, if anything, right now? Is it all at the Keep Vermont Cool organization at this time? So it's kind of this person to suggest that, but it is definitely not just us doing this work. I mean, we do have a lot going on. So again, we have plenty of resources that we share on our website, on our social media pages, but we are also a part of an Act on Climate Coalition, which is a host of Vermont organizations focused on climate action work. So if you're interested, I definitely recommend just doing a quick search on that coalition. You'll see the large list of organizations doing really important work. And I do recommend that you follow them, check them out, see what types of events they've got going on. It's certainly not just us, but thank you for being here and for finding us, and we certainly appreciate that. All right, and let's see, just trying to catch up on all of the questions here. I do want to lift this one up. I know we've talked a little bit about the financials, but this question is, the issue in many towns, including Middlebury, is financial. How much is this all going to cost? Because we probably can't afford it. And I just wanted to quickly lift that up, because I know we talk about the numbers sort of large scale, broadly based, but I think for a small state like Vermont, that is a really daunting question of how will we get through this? How will we afford this? So again, just wanted to lift that up because cost is really on the back of all of our minds. And if there's anything else you wanted to add on that financial perspective, wanted to create the space to do that.
I mean, yeah, absolutely. I think that the cost is the key, maybe the key takeaway that we hope to leave you with is that we don't have enough money. No community has enough money. So we need to actually figure out ways to create money and do it in a way that we are all coming together and paying for something instead of responding after an event where it's going to cost a lot more money. The National Association of Building Sciences every couple of years updates how much savings you can get from investing before an event. And it's $1 for every $6 of flood infrastructure. So we're all paying for it now. All of our tax dollars are going across the US. And as you saw, Vermont is getting a lot of it. However, it's still not enough. Even with the money that Vermont is getting, it's not nearly enough. So we really need to come up with these state resources and make sure that we're not only creating the resources, but we're also dictating the type of program that we want to have and how we're going to protect and affect and work with the people who are most vulnerable, both physically and socially vulnerable.
Great, thank you so much. And I think with that, we'll wrap up the Q&A just so I can get you all out on time. I've got just a few more slides and I will leave contact information on the last slide. So if you have additional questions that weren't answered, you can feel free to reach out and we will get back to you. But again, thank you both so much for answering all of those questions, and thank you to our audience for having such great insight and being a part of this conversation. All right, so I will go back to sharing my screen just for a brief time, and you should be able to all see that. So as I mentioned earlier, there is an opportunity that I have for you all to take action right here and now. So we've heard a lot about the destruction and disaster that Vermont has faced in recent years, constantly just cleaning up mess after mess. And we have gotten pretty tired of that. So a few months ago, BPIRG launched its latest summer canvas campaign, Make Big Oil Pay. And the concept is simple. If you make a mess, you should help clean it up. But what happens when none of us are responsible for making that mess? So we know that big oil and gas companies like ExxonMobil and Chevron have spent decades just raking in these unprecedented profits while leaving this path of destruction behind. So we think that some of those profits should be redirected towards climate solutions like infrastructure repairs or renewable energy, things of that nature. So we've seen with the recent flooding here in Vermont that these solutions are both urgent and critical. And just a quick fun fact, this campaign was launched on Church Street, featuring a 20-foot tall inflatable pig to represent the greed of these companies. And there it is, the inflatable pig. All right, so here's what you can do right here, right now. You can visit makebigoilpay.org to learn more about this campaign and to sign the petition to ensure that big oil and gas companies pay their fair share for the climate crisis. And again, if you have any questions, my contact information is right here, so please do reach out. But really, other than that, I think we've got it covered for this evening. So again, I would like to thank Rebuild by Design and all those who came to attend. Your dedication and commitment to the climate movement is really what allows us to push forward as a small but very mighty state. So again, if you have questions, if you'd like to connect offline, please do reach out. And I think I'll just leave it here. So I hope you have a wonderful evening, and I will see you all again very soon. Thanks so much and take care.